What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the Season 4 finale of Better Call Saul, an episode called Werner. And as great as this season was from start to finish, I have to say, they really did stick the landing. I was slightly disappointed that we didn't get a little bit of Nacho's story, but I totally understand, because this episode was about wrapping up two major storylines. One where Jimmy McGill becomes a lawyer again, and the other, which I think is the biggest surprise curveball story of the year in television, the relationship between Mike and Werner. It's a storyline that nobody asked for. It's a storyline that nobody saw coming. But I was absolutely blown away by the amount of emotion I felt as that storyline drew to a close. It featured easily some of Jonathan Banks' finest work for either Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. And it's incredible to me, after so many seasons of telling these stories between Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould, that they can continue to surprise and amaze and impress. These guys were born to write riveting television. And knowing that AMC has already renewed it for Season 5 makes me thrilled beyond words. However, the big question is now, will they decide to wrap up this saga in Season 5? Because as much as I personally have been waiting for a season where we finally get to see Jimmy McGill as Saul Goodman, it seems like all the conversations I hear with the writers and the filmmakers involved with the show is that Better Call Saul was about becoming Saul Goodman, not about featuring Saul Goodman. So I think the speculation machine will go into overdrive about what might be in store for us next season. But let's talk about what we have in front of us, because tonight's episode was absolutely fantastic. As always, I'd like to give a brief shout out to Better Call Saul Insider, which had a really good episode this past week because they featured Kim Wexler herself, Ray Seahorn. And for as long as I can remember, I've been calling her Rhea Seahorn. It's actually Ray. Everybody on the podcast was just calling her Ray, so I'm glad I finally got that corrected. But because it was a podcast, she was offering some really interesting insights about how to use your voice. And apparently, according to her and her acting coach, or at least her voice coach, your natural voice is the voice you wake up with. That's actually closest to how you actually speak. But due to internal and external pressures throughout the day, our voices tend to rise up. If you're hypercaffeinated, or if you're really stressed out, or if you're really emotional. And she says as an actress, she's always trying to get back to that natural way of speaking, because that's where your voice sounds its best. But it was also fascinating getting to hear Ray and Vince Gilligan talk about their creative process. Episode 9 was directed by Vince Gilligan, which is why it was particularly good. And he has this fascinating approach where he watches all the shots of all the locations up to that point to make sure that he doesn't shoot anything quite the same way. And he offered some brilliant advice to young, aspiring writers. He said, wherever you want your story to go in terms of a specific moment or a specific beat or a specific event, never take a shortcut by having your characters say or do something stupid. It's kind of like in a horror movie when you're trying to get everybody separated so that the killer can start picking them off one at a time, and somebody says or does something really stupid to make it happen, and it's frustrating for the viewer. And I think that's one thing we can always see in this show and in Breaking Bad, is that Peter Gould and Vince Gilligan managed to create so many conflicting views and agendas where logically we can see where they're coming from, where emotionally we can see where they're coming from. It's very easy to put all the good ideas and all the good motivations in one character. But what creates such incredible dramatic tension in a finale like this is the fact that characters like Mike and Werner and Kim and Jimmy, we can see where all these characters are coming from even when they're in direct opposition to each other. But let's talk about the opening of the episode, because it was particularly good. Because one thing I kept forgetting in seasons 1, 2, and 3 of Better Call Saul is that Michael McKean has an extraordinary singing voice. At this point, Michael McKean's in his 70s, but I tend to forget that he was one of the stars of This Is Spinal Tap, and that he's one of the stars of Christopher Guest's film A Mighty Wind. And in both those movies, he plays a hell of a lot of music and sings his ass off. So it's great seeing this flashback where Jimmy's at a karaoke bar celebrating the fact that he's just become a lawyer. He's begging Chuck to stay. He wants his big brother to be proud of him, and particularly wants his big brother to see him sing. And Kim picks a song for him, ABBA's The Winner Takes It All. And I don't know if Bob Odenkirk is tone deaf in real life or if he was just playing Jimmy McGill as tone deaf, but he gets up there and just starts murdering the song, like shifting in and out of different octaves, missing notes, just classic tin ear all the way. And then he invites his brother up. And not only is Chuck the smartest man in the room, who sets up this impossible ideal that Jimmy could never live up to, but he's also got this beautiful singing voice, and he just starts crushing the ABBA tune. And I was just smiling ear to ear, watching these two brilliant actors singing side by side, because even if you are a really good singer, it's hard to maintain your perfect pitch if someone beside you is just murdering the song entirely. So I was blown away by Michael McKean and Bob Odenkirk in that particular scene. Also, if you haven't seen This Is Spinal Tap, go back and watch it. It is one of the funniest fake documentaries ever made. So for the sake of simplicity with this recap, I think it's easier if we just break it into the two main stories and talk about them separately. Otherwise, I'll be bouncing back and forth like a game of Pong. But let's start with the story of Mike and Werner, because, as I said at the opening, I was completely caught off guard by how grim and dramatic and moving the storyline became when it seemed so innocuous and harmless at the beginning of the season, and they gave us this great red herring in the character of Kai, where we just assumed from the outset Kai was going to cause problems, Kai was going to end up getting his throat cut. But sure enough, the smartest, most mature, responsible member of the German crew is the one who gets in the most trouble. And we see Jonathan Banks in full-blown 80s action badass mode as he's organizing all of Gus's men trying to find Werner. Because when I was a little kid, the first time I got exposed to Jonathan Banks was in movies like 48 Hours and Beverly Hills Cop. These were the movies that just defined my youth. So I always think of him as like a badass 80s cop or a badass 80s crook. So it's so damn cool to see him ordering guys around and seeing how brilliant he is at tracking down Werner. We get a lot of scenes at the travel wire where this poor unfortunate guy first has to deal with Mike and then he has to deal with Lalo. Because as we learned, Werner has his wife wiring him money there. And it's from there that he picks the resort that he's going to go to up in Colorado, where he and his wife can have a few days together. And while Mike uses deception and charm and persuasion to get the information, as we see, Lalo basically is like a ninja blasting through the ceiling and back to the other side, resorting to violence to get what he wants. In any event, you basically have a race down between Mike and Lalo trying to get to Werner first. And one of my favorite scenes of the episode is when Lalo's following Mike, and Mike's trying to figure out a way to lose them, so he goes into a parking lot. And of course, we know from the earlier seasons of Better Call Saul, Mike knows a thing or two about how these parking lots function. And he comes up with this great trick where he takes out a piece of gum, and I was like, what the hell is he doing? And he smooths out the wrapper into like a long card, and as he leaves the parking lot, he slides in the wrapper, and from the inside, we see it totally like gumming up and melting the inside. And as a result, Lalo ends up getting stuck behind this slightly obese guy who's like swigging a Slurpee or a Big Gulp or something. But going back to the whole Beverly Hills Cop connection with Jonathan Banks, what it really reminded me of is when Eddie Murphy sticks the banana up the tailpipe of the people trying to follow him. But it was just a fantastic scene of cops and robbers, like a slow speed car chase as Mike hauls ass away. So no one knows better than Mike that both Werner and his wife, their lives are absolutely in danger, and that Werner's life pretty much is already forfeit. Mike's trying to do the best job he can at minimizing the amount of violence that's going to go down, while at the same time remaining totally loyal to his boss Gus. And I love how this episode really successfully teased the fact that Lalo is going to be a major adversary for Gus in Season 5, because we see that Lalo is basically studying Gus and gathering as much data information on his operations as he possibly can. And he very cleverly very successfully calls Werner at the pool, and in a very subtle fashion starts trying to tease information out of Werner. And Werner's so naive and unassuming, he starts allowing some of this information to come out of him. And what might be the best dramatic beat of the episode, Mike steps in, puts the phone back on the receiver, and tells Werner not to say another word. And much to his credit, we get a really sad scene where Mike calls Gus and says, "Let this be a mistake." In his own terse, taciturn way, we see that Mike genuinely feels affection and friendship for Werner and is trying to do everything in his power to look after his interests. But when he sees that Gus will not be moved, he says, "Let me do it." And this is where we got a scene that just about tore my heart out, because Werner's too naive initially to understand the gravity of the situation. He just assumed all along that his friend Michael would be mad at him, but that over time he would be forgiven, that he would have his time with his wife, and that the work would continue. And Mike has to remind him in brutal fashion that no matter what he says, and that no matter what he does, Gus will never trust him again. And if Gus can't trust you, the inevitable is going to take place. The only concession Mike is willing to make is he gives Werner at least a chance to try to send his wife back home so that she won't be murdered too. But he has to send her home in a way that will arouse the least amount of suspicion so that she doesn't accidentally end up putting herself in danger. And while Werner's successful, Mike then has to basically explain to Werner that we'll make it look like an accident, her investigation will come up with a very plausible story. And as Werner accepts his fate, he has kind of a throwaway line about how beautiful and clear the stars are in the desert sky. And then we get this astonishing scene where the camera pulls way, way, way back, and we see Werner walking off. He basically is giving Mike his back so that Mike wanted to basically shoot him in the face. And from an extreme long shot, we finally see Mike raise his gun and take Werner out from behind. Because fans of Better Call Saul they love conspiracies and they love detail. Who knows? There might be some people out there who are convinced that because it was at such a distance that perhaps Mike didn't kill him after all. But from my own interpretation of the events, I'm going to take it at face value because it feels more consistent with Mike's character that that's the route he would take. In particular because the next time we see Mike, when we see him down in the bare beginnings of the super lab and Gail's getting all excited about the work that he's going to be able to do down there, when we see Mike, he is standing there like an angel of death, just like an engine of total destruction. just his body language and his expression just communicates so much. And Gale basically gets out of there as fast as he possibly can. And that's when Mike and Gus share this look that I think is going to go down in history as one of the best unspoken moments between two characters in this show. But obviously, the feature attraction of this episode was what Jimmy McGill and Kim Wexler were going to come up with in order to try to have him reinstated as a lawyer. And what we see is one of the most aggressive but subtle charm offensives in television history. It's one of those things where everything they do, you don't quite know how much return on investment you're going to get in terms of the impression you might be making. But it's basically a multi-pronged approach to create rumors and stories and impressions that will eventually, slowly but surely, get around to the people that might possibly reinstate Jimmy. And the first move they make is that Jimmy basically hangs out at the graveyard on the 1-year anniversary of Chuck's death. And he basically wants people seeing him in a state of mourning at his brother's grave. And he has this little expression, he's like, watermelon pickles, but he basically makes himself get choked up. He's at a loss for words. And he's definitely having an impact on this one couple that comes by to pay their respects. But of course, in between visits, he basically runs over to Kim and starts slurping coffee and eating bear claws. And we can tell that Jimmy's performance as a brother in mourning is a complete and total facade. And we see that Jimmy also cuts a check for $23,000 anonymously for the Charles McGill Reading Room Memorial. And it's one of those situations where, in theory, it's supposed to be anonymous. But of course, they leak it to a few key people so that nobody will be under any illusions as to who is responsible for this memorial. And Jimmy's outside smoking a cigarette, but he's kind of hunched over, looking like he's crying. And he's visibly annoyed when Kim tells him that he can't have any of the cheeseburgers at the party because if you're in mourning, you're not particularly hungry. But one of the more interesting scenes this episode, and I'd totally forgotten this was even part of Chuck's will. We see a meeting of the board that Jimmy's a part of for giving out 3 scholarships each year. And we get this great montage where Howard's calling in these high school students for their interviews. But what's cool about it, the montage cuts off the kids like in the first few words that they say. It was just I've never seen a montage quite like that, where Howard would ask a question, they would follow up. We can kind of imagine and fill in the gaps, but it was just a really interesting sequence. But the one that catches Jimmy's eye is a young girl by the name of Esposito, who 2 years prior was guilty of shoplifting, which she claims led to her taking an interest in the law. He makes a very passionate case on her behalf. It falls on deaf ears, and as he tells her afterwards, he basically tracks her down out in the parking lot. It's like, no matter what you said or no matter what you ever did, everybody up there, their minds were already made up about you. You've been branded a shoplifter. And in probably one of the most sincere moments of the entire season, because in both this episode and the last episode, the big question is, when is Jimmy McGill being sincere? Is he being sincere enough? And in this one moment, we know he's absolutely being genuine and sincere, where he gives her some insanely harsh truths about the reality of the world, but that there's no greater revenge than doing well and being successful, and that all those people on the 35th floor that shot her down, that it should be her ultimate ambition to end up on the 50th floor and make them hate her for it. While Jimmy McGill's a master of deception and he wears many faces, I really feel like he kind of set the faces aside for that one scene because he sees in her how he has been treated. Everybody always assumes he's dishonest. Everybody assumes he's a crook, and he's never going to be able to shake that reputation. And he's basically giving her the advice that we see that he's going to follow at the end of this episode. So Jimmy and Kim have a massive strategy session, and it seems like their killer punch that they're going to kind of hold in reserve is this letter that Chuck wrote to Jimmy. And obviously there was a ton of debate and speculation about that letter at the beginning of the season. Some people hypothesized that perhaps Kim had written it, trying to coax some sort of human reaction out of Jimmy. And it was definitely one of the most emotional moments of the season. The first time Jimmy read it with no emotion whatsoever, and Kim was horrified just how little emotion Jimmy felt for his brother's death. But when Jimmy's given his moment to make an official statement, basically their plan is that he's going to read this letter and it's going to be their secret weapon. And what precedes is a scene where it took me until about halfway through before I realized, oh, Jimmy's conning them, he's conning Kim, and he's conning us. And it was just beautiful to behold because I completely bought his sincerity for, like I said, for like the first half of it, because he pretends to try and read the letter and say, you know what? This is a private thing. It's got to stay between me and Chuck. He puts it away, and he starts talking about how his brother was the most brilliant man he ever knew, and that to make him proud and to make him take notice was basically a Herculean task that was almost impossible to achieve, but that on the rare moments where you pulled it off, nothing made you feel better, and that for the rest of his life, whether he's a lawyer or not, Jimmy McGill's going to strive to be worthy of the McGill name. Of course, as we know, he's going to ditch that name very soon, but he's tearing up and he's choking up, and the people he's speaking to, they're tearing up and choking up, and Kim is watching, and she's so proud, and she's smiling, and she's moved, and it's just this beautiful moment. But the fact that we as the audience, we know who this guy is, and the fact that we can see that he's basically pulling the ultimate Jimmy McGill con. It was just beautiful to behold. This is what we live for in TV, where you just have great writing and great performances. And it's only really possible when you know these characters for as long as we do, where you can pick up on all these little subtle details. And then we get this insanely powerful scene that's heartbreakingly brief, but as Kim and Jimmy are walking away, and they're basically spiking the football in victory because they know they pulled it off. And Kim becomes absolutely horrified when Jimmy starts describing them as assholes and as suckers, and he's describing them in terms of complete and total utter contempt and condescension. And Jimmy's so caught up in his glee and his joy about this con they pulled, he doesn't even notice that on Kim's face, it's basically one of those situations like, oh my God, I may have aided and abetted and perhaps created a true monster, or at least a monstrous human being. And when Jimmy learns that he's going to be a lawyer again, first thing he does, he asks for a doing business as form because he says he's no longer going to be operating under his own name. And Kim's like, what? It was incredible, but I was blown away by the brevity of the scene. They immediately just wrap things up. At the end of a season, sometimes you expect a moment of decompression or perhaps one of those black and white flash forward scenes, but there's none of that. They don't allow us to process or digest the moment at all. It's just boom. Saul Goodman is born. We're moving forward. So the question is now, where does the show go in season 5 if season 5 is in fact the last season of this remarkable show? I think the most obvious thing is that we'll see a Gus and Mike versus Lalo scenario. And the curveball or the X factor in that struggle will be, how is Nacho employed, and is Nacho successfully able to pull himself out of this life of crime that he's no longer that enamored with? But the big story will be, what is the final fate between Kim and Jimmy? And something tells me they're going to end up going head to head in a court of law. And Kim will probably beat the pants off him, but it'll be absolutely brilliant and juicy to behold. I thought we were going to see a complete total destruction of their relationship as we know it in the course of this season. I was wrong. But Ray Seahorn is such a marvelous, brilliant actress. I'm delighted that we're going to get a lot more of her character in the next season. So as someone who runs a YouTube channel devoted to talking about movies and TV shows, there are a few moments where I'm happier running this channel than when a season manages to deliver or surpass and exceed expectations. Whether you're talking about the writing or the production design or the performances or the sense of atmosphere in place, from any vantage point that you look at Better Call Saul, it is one of the best shows on TV. And the fact that they managed to continue cementing their legacy with each season and episode makes you think that this is going to be one of those sagas that people talk about for many years to come. I mean, people 10 years later are still talking about The Sopranos. The Sopranos was only, I think, 7 or 6 seasons. I think 7 seasons. But between Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, they are absolutely leaving The Sopranos in their dust at this point. And the only question remains is, just how far will they take it? When will Peter Gould and Vince Gilligan feel inclined to say, you know what? We're done. We're moving on. In any event, everybody involved in this show should absolutely take a bow. I imagine none of them will get much of a vacation before they have to dive right into season 5. But for my part, it's been a pleasure and a privilege reviewing and recapping this season. And for all of you who've been watching my reviews throughout the season, you have my genuine, sincere thanks. But if you enjoyed my recaps and reviews along the way, please consider subscribing to my channel. There are a ton of movies coming out in the near future that I want to review, and a bunch of stuff on Netflix and a bunch of stuff on HBO. But when it comes to ongoing shows, right now, I have nothing on my calendar till like December 2nd. I'm going to be tackling Night Flyers. But if anybody has some razor sharp recommendations about shows that are ongoing right now where I should get caught up or jump on board and start doing recaps and review, please send those recommendations my way. I always appreciate the suggestions because some of my favorite shows have come from YouTube commenters giving me a heads up about shows that I need to be following. But thanks so much for watching my video. I really appreciate it. If you want to talk more, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But until next time, onwards and upwards. Or maybe I should say, Better Call Saul!